We're now in day 3 of the 2020 election as votes continue to be counted in a handful of states, and no clear projection of the overall race yet made by the Associated Press or by other major networks. But with former Vice President Biden gaining in Georgia and in the critical state of Pennsylvania, even as doubts remain about Arizona and Nevada. Joining us now is Rick Davis. He's partner in Stone Court Capital and manager of John McCain's presidential campaign, and I'm delighted to say he's also our political contributor. So, Rick, as we take a look at this, it emphasizes the need, even as we get to the very end, everybody's eager to get an answer. We have to be very, very careful. The Associated Press is out with a report about why they are not making a projection yet in Pennsylvania, even though it looks good for Vice President Biden, because there's some issues with some ballots in Pittsburgh. There's over 100,000 votes yet to be counted.
Yeah, I mean, we're down to the 5-yard line. We see the goalposts in front of us, but we have to take some time. We said this on Tuesday night that we knew there'd be an effort to count votes that's going to extend to the balance of the week, and now's not the time to get too far ahead of ourselves. Look, this is how the electoral process is supposed to work, and these votes are being counted that were cast, in places like Arizona. They're later stage votes where people dropped off ballots on Election Day. They were set aside. They're the last ones to count. They have a slightly different look to them than some of the other votes that were cast in advance of the election. So we see Joe Biden's lead actually diminishing a little bit in Arizona, but on the reverse in Pennsylvania, they set aside all the early votes and counted the Election Day votes first, which looked good for Donald Trump, and now they're counting those ballots that came in later through the electoral vote or for the early vote process, and it looks much better for Joe Biden. Until the votes are done, this election is incredibly close, just like in 2016. We just have to be patient to decide who the end is. I would say all indications in each of these open states is that Joe Biden has the votes that in the pipeline that it looks like he could get to 270. So it's still advantage Biden, but until those votes are counted and finished, we still have a race on.
Okay, we're also joined by our other partner in crime, if I can call her that, Jeanne Zaino. She's our other political contributor. She's a professor of political science at Iona College. So, Jeanne, where do you think the race stands right now? It looks like it's going in Vice President Biden's direction, but it's not there yet.
David, I think that I've been so surprised by what has happened in Georgia, for instance, that we are at a point now where we may see Georgia, and again, we have to say may see Georgia turn blue. But I think where it stands right now is that we are probably going to see something similar in terms of a count that we saw in 2016, but the other way, where Joe Biden perhaps gets around the same number of electoral votes that Donald Trump got in 2016. So I think because these states are so narrow, we're going to see something along those lines when this thing is all said and done.
Yeah, Rick, one of the things we didn't have, as I recall, at least way back in 2016, is a slew of lawsuits. The President of the United States has not been shy, including last night when he had what I thought was sort of an extraordinary, I wouldn't call it a news conference because it didn't take any questions, but sort of a statement, really saying there's a lot of fraud going on, they're stealing the election, and yet I still haven't heard any specifics.
Well, it's very hard to document specifics. This is such a localized situation. I mean, most of the suits that are being brought are specific to a polling place in a certain precinct or a county count room and getting access to watch the vote count. And so I think it's important to note that none of these lawsuits are actually pointing to fraud in any way. It's all transparency. And by and large, they're all being handled at the local level with state and district judges who are encouraging that transparency. Nobody is trying to hide the vote. And so I think all this will come and go. It's a sort of footnote to this process. I don't blame the president for using every tactic he can to ensure that the vote is fair and that it is properly reported. So those are the remedies that everybody has in the electoral process and should always, if you feel like you need more transparency, you should ask for it. It's what we do in America. That being said, to associate that with fraud I think you have a higher standard, and you ought to have to show where that fraud is occurring. Right now, we don't see it.
Well, as you say, it's not. You can't hold it against. You certainly can't hold it against the President of the United States to say, I want to make sure everything's on the legit. I want to make sure all the votes get counted. At the same time, you got to think about whether there has to be an exit strategy here. I want to quote actually from Roy Blunt, the senior Republican senator from Missouri, who was out and spoke to reporters today. And it was interesting, I thought, what he said. He said, if they have a case to make, referring to the President Trump's campaign, there's a process where they make that. I don't think it's unreasonable to allow the president to wait for that number to be apparent. I also don't think it's unreasonable for Vice President Biden to accept the unofficial result and do whatever he thinks he should do. You know, part of the obligation of leadership is you should always have in your mind, how do I leave? Is that a message that's starting to be sent by some senior Republicans to the White House?
Yes, and I think not only to the White House, but to other Republicans. Roy Blunt, in addition to being the senior senator from Missouri, is also in leadership in the United States Senate. He is the chairman of the Policy Committee, which is a very powerful spot in Republican leadership in the United States Senate. And so when he speaks, he's speaking not just as the senator from Missouri, but also as one of the key people around Mitch McConnell. So a lot of people are going to be reading into this. I would commend everybody, a little commercial, to go to the YouTube today sometime and watch the John McCain concession speech.
Yeah.
In 2008, we had a lot of tension around the first African-American becoming president. And John McCain's concession speech is being hailed around the world when it occurred as the proper way for democracy to transfer power. And so if you want to see how it was done not too long ago, I'd say that speech is something worth looking up while we have this debate today and into the weekend.
I'm so glad you mentioned that, because I'd actually forgotten it. I was in the control room at ABC News when that happened in the middle of the night back in 2008, and outside, as I recall, up on that platform. And I remember thinking it was so gracious, so statesmanlike, really good for the Republic. I agree we should all go back and watch that one more time. Jeanne, I want to come over to you at the same time, even as we talk about the possibility of Republicans starting to send a message to President Trump. We have to think about what's going on with the Democrats, because whatever happens ultimately in this election, I think the one thing that seems to be pretty clear is that great blue wave didn't happen. That people who came forward with Medicare for all, with wealth tax, and that there was not a lot of enthusiasm across the country for that. How do the Democrats get themselves back together and govern perhaps a little more toward the center?
Not only did the Great Blue Wave not happen, in fact, quite unexpectedly, the Democrats lost seats in the House. Of course, they retained the majority because they picked up so many seats in 2018. But they lost seats in the House and, of course, didn't make the gains that were expected in the Senate and look likely, and of course, we don't know yet, but look likely not to capture the majority there. And I think Democrats are going to have to be very, very careful going forward. We have the Georgia special election. We know that the party that has lost the White House, if indeed it does turn out that Joe Biden takes it, has a tougher time in these special elections. And going forward, they're going to have to think about what happened in 2020, that their policies, their progressive policies, didn't resonate rather in the way that they expected and wanted. And now we're looking at divided government, in which you're going to have a Joe Biden, if he is in office, unable to fulfill the promises that he made, the very progressive promises that they wanted him to make, that he was flirting with at some points. That's going to be tougher if he's president. And they're going to have, by some estimations, a long time before they have any chance of picking up the Senate. If you look at the estimates on that, you're looking at several cycles before Democrats can potentially take the Senate again. And they have a potential, as we know, if again, in a big if, Joe Biden takes the White House, of losing seats rather in a midterm when their president is in the White House. So Democrats are going to have to try to do a better job of understanding where Democrats, independents, moderate are in these purple states and repeating what they did in 2018, not what they did in 2020.